Boris that Boris was having his pause. They kept me locked up for a week and a half, and then they let me go. I was an outpatient for a while before I found Dr. S. With her low musical voice, restrained smile, and good ear for poetry, she propped me up, still props me up, in fact. I don't like to remember the mad woman. She shamed me. For a long time I was reluctant to look at what she had written in a black and white notebook during her stay on the ward. I knew what was scrawled on the outside in handwriting that looked nothing like mine, brain shards, but I wouldn't open it. I was afraid of her, you see. When my girl came to visit, Daisy hid her unease. I don't know exactly what she saw, but I can guess. A woman gaunt from not eating, still confused, her body wooden from drugs, a person who couldn't respond appropriately to her daughter's words, who couldn't hold her own child. And then, when she left, I heard her moan to the nurse, the noise of a sob in her throat. It's like it's not my mom. I was lost to myself then, but to recall that sentence now is an agony. I do not forgive myself. The pause was French, with limp but shiny brown hair. She had significant breasts that were real, not manufactured, narrow, rectangular glasses, and an excellent mind. She was young, of course, 20 years younger than I was, and my suspicion is that Boris had lusted after his colleague for some time before he lunged at her significant regions. I have pictured it over and over, Boris, snow-white locks falling onto his forehead as he grips the bosom of said paws near the cages of genetically modified rats. I always see it in the lab, although this is probably wrong. The two of them were rarely alone there, and the team would have noticed noisy grappling in their midst. Perhaps they took refuge in a toilet stall, my Boris pounding away at his fellow scientist, his eyes moving upward in their sockets as he neared explosion. I knew all about it. I had seen his eyes roll thousands of times. The banality of the story, the fact that it is repeated every day ad nauseum by men who discover all at once or gradually that what is does not have to be, and then act to free themselves from the aging women who have taken care of them and their children for years, does not mute the misery, jealousy, and humiliation that comes over those left behind. Women scorned. I wailed and shrieked and beat the wall with my fists. I frightened him. He wanted peace, to be left alone, to go his own way with the well-mannered neuroscientist of his dreams, a woman with whom he had no past, no freighted pains, no grief, and no conflict. And yet, he said, pause, not stop, to keep the narrative open in case he changed his mind. A cruel crack of hope. Boris the wall. Boris who never shouts. Boris shaking his head on the sofa, looking discomfited. Boris the rat man who married a poet in 1979. Boris, why did you leave me? I had to get out of the apartment because being there hurt. The rooms and furniture, the sounds from the street, the light that shone into my study, the toothbrushes in the small rack, the bedroom closet with its missing knob, each had become like a bone that ached, a joint or rib or vertebrae in an articulated anatomy of shared memory. And each familiar thing, leaden with the accumulated meanings of time, seemed to weigh in my own body, and I found I could not bear them. And so I left Brooklyn and went home for the summer to the backwater town on what used to be the prairie in Minnesota, out where I had grown up. Dr. S. was not against it. We would have telephone sessions once a week except during August when she took her usual vacation. The university had been understanding, about my crack-up, and I would return to teaching in September. This was to be the yawn between crazed winter and sane fall, an uneventful hollow to fill with poems. I would spend time with my mother and put flowers on my father's grave. My sister and Daisy would come for visits, and I had been hired to teach a poetry class for kids at the local arts guild. Award-winning homegrown poet offers workshop, ran a headline in the Bondon News. The Doris P. Zimmer Award for Poetry is an obscure prize that dropped down on my head from nowhere, offered exclusively to a woman whose work falls under the rubric experimental. I had accepted this dubious honor and the check that accompanied it graciously, but with private reservations, only to find that any prize is better than none, that the term award-winning offers a useful, if purely decorative gloss on the poet who lives in a world that knows nothing of poems. As John Ashbery once said, being a famous poet is not the same thing as being famous. And I am not a famous poet. Many pages later, it was the title that got me thinking, Persuasion. My mother was reading it for her next book club with the other swans, and they had invited me, Mia, Mistress Degree, to say a few words of introduction. A story of love postponed, of love found, lost, and refound. Austen's heroine is persuaded to give him up. Persuasion, to influence, sway, move, induce, soft pedal, weigh upon, cajole, convince, the work of words mostly, words that play on weakness, on a vulnerable spot. Honeyed tongues wag as men sweet-talk women into parting their thighs, the smooth palaver that breaks down feminine resistance. Wily women urge men toward this or that crime. The cool seductress of cinema with a teeny little pearl-handled revolver in her purse. Speed-talking Rosalind Russell snaps lines at Cary Grant in His Girl Friday. Love as verbal war. Scheherazade keeps on talking and stays alive one more night. The troubadours moon and croon for a lady's favor. I will win her with words and music. I will turn human anatomy into roses and stars and seas. I will dissect the beloved's body in metaphor. I will compliment her. I will lure her with wit, had we but world enough and time. I will tell stories. I will stay alive one more night. Comedies end in marriage, tragedies in death. Otherwise, they aren't so different. In the end, Scheherazade gets the man who wanted to kill her. But he's besotted by then. Anne Elliot gets Captain Wentworth. The wrap-up is swift. It is the getting him back that counts, and the marrying, but in spirit, Austen knows they were wed before and suffered the emptiness of separation for 6 long years. This story of Mia and Boris begins deep in a marriage after years of sex and talk and fights. If it is to be a comedy, then it must fall into Stanley Cavell's territory, the comedies of repetition, of the already married coming together again. The philosopher gives us a trenchant parenthesis, quote, "Can human beings change?" The humor and the sadness of remarriage comedies can be said to result from the fact that we have no good answer to that question, end quote. The Eleatics did not believe in change, in motion. When does one thing cease to be itself and become another? Diogenes walks back and forth in silence. Can we change and stay the same? I remember I repeat. More many pages? This is entitled Commentary, and just so you know, the science, of course, is all real. I had to answer that on my tour. Commentary. The instruments of darkness tell us truths. What are they? Boys will be boys, rambunctious, wild, kicking, hanging from the trees. Girls will be girls, gentle, nurturing, sweet, passive, conniving, stealthy, mean. We all start out the same in our mother's wombs. We, all of us, when floating in the amniotic sea of our earliest oblivion, have gonads. If the Y chromosome didn't swoop in to act on the gonads of some of us and make testes, we would all become women. In biology, the Genesis story is reversed. Adam becomes Adam out of Eve, not the other way around. Men are the metaphorical ribs of women, not women of men. Most of the time, it's XX equals ovaries, XY equals testes. The renowned Greek physician Galen believed that female genitalia were the inversion of the males and vice versa, a view that held for centuries. This is Galen. Turn outward the woman's, turn inward, so to speak, and full double the man's, and you will find the same in both in every respect. End quote. Of course, outward trumped inward every time. Inward was definitely worse. Exactly why I can't say. Outward is pretty vulnerable, if you ask me. In fact, castration anxiety makes a lot of sense. If I were carrying my reproductive organs on the outside, I'd be pretty damned nervous about that delicate little package, too. As with the human navel, the ancient sex model had innies and outies, which meant that an innie might just surprise you by becoming an outie, especially if you went around behaving like someone who already had an outie. That hidden, folded-over yard might just make a sudden appearance. Montaigne, great literary peak of the 16th century that he was, subscribed to the innie-outie thesis. Montaigne. Males and females are cast in the same mold, and education and usage accepted, the difference is not great. End quote. He repeats a well-known story about Marie Germain, who was just plain Marie until the age of 22 in Montaigne's version, 15 in other versions, but one day, due to strenuous exercise, jumping over a ditch while chasing pigs, the male rod popped out of her, and Germain was born. Incredible, you say. Impossible, you say. But there is a particular family in Puerto Rico and another in Texas with a genetic condition in which XY looks for all the world exactly like XX. In other words, phenotype disguises genotype, until puberty, that is, when late in the game the little girls become little boys and grow up to be men. Carla turns into Carlos. Darling daughter becomes darling son without a surgical instrument in sight. What is certain is that in utero, the sex differentiation story is fragile. Things can and do get all mixed up. Mia, you are saying, get to the point. Relax, breathe deeply, and I will make my rhetorical turn shortly. This is a question of sameness and difference, of what Socrates in the Republic calls a word controversy. He tells his interlocutor Glaucon that they find themselves in heuristic wrangling because they hadn't bothered to inquire, quote, what was the sense of different nature and what was the sense of same nature, and what we were aiming at in our definition when we allotted to a different nature different practices and to the same nature the same, end quote. The great father of Western philosophy is working out the man-woman problem for his utopia and comes to rest, uneasily I think, but he rests nevertheless, on this, quote, but if the only difference is that the female bears and the male begets, we shall not admit that it is a difference relevant for our purpose, end quote. The purpose, whether women should be given the same education as men and then allowed to rule beside them in the Republic. Mostly the same, but different in parts, mostly in those lower begetting and bearing parts, or different in kind. Thomas Laqueur, bless his heart, has written a whole book on the subject. Once the innie-outie theory collapsed, sometime in the 18th century, women were no longer inverted men. We were wholly other. Our bones, nerves, muscles, organs, tissues, all different. Another machinery altogether, and this biological alien was ever so delicate. While it is true that the mind is common to all human beings, wrote Paul Victor de Sèze in 1786, the active employment thereof is not conducive to all. For women, in fact, this activity can be quite harmful. Because of their natural weakness, greater brain activity in women would exhaust all the other organs and thus disrupt their proper functioning. Above all, however, it would be the generative organs which would be the most fatigued and endangered through the overexertion of the female brain. End quote. The thought shrivels your ovaries theory had a long and robust life. Sorry, no water. Dr. George Beard, author of American Nervousness, argued, it's true, it's all true, unlike the squaw in her wigwam, who focused on her nether regions and popped out one child after another, the modern woman was being deformed by thinking. And to prove it, he cited the work of a distinguished colleague who had measured highly educated uteruses and found them, and found them to be only half the size of those never exposed to learning. In 1873, Dr. Edward Clark, following the noble Beard, published a book with a friendly title, Sex Education, A Fair Chance for Girls, in which he argued that menstruating girls should be banned from the classroom and cited hard evidence from clinical studies conducted at Harvard on intellectual women who had determined that too much knowledge had made these poor creatures sterile, anemic, hysterical, and even mad. Maybe that was my problem. I read too much and my brain exploded. In 1906, the anatomist Robert Bennett Bean claimed that the corpus callosum, the neural fibers that bind the two halves of the brain together, were bigger in men than in women, and hypothesized that, this is Bean, exceptional size of the corpus callosum may mean exceptional intellectual activity, end quote. Big thoughts equals big CC. But no one utters such nonsense now, you say. Science has changed. It is based on facts. And yet colleagues of my wayward husband are hard at work measuring brain volume and thickness, scanning its oxygenated blood flow, injecting hormones into mice, rats, and monkeys, and knocking out genes left and right to prove beyond all doubt that the difference between the sexes is profound, predetermined by evolution, and more or less fixed. We have male and female brains, different not only for reproductive functions, but in countless other essential ways. While it is true that the mind is common to all human beings, each sex has its own kind of mind. Dr. Renato Sabatini, for example, distinguished neurophysiologist who was a postdoc fellow at the Max Planck Institute, enumerates a long list of differences between us and them and then announces, quote, "This may account, scientists say, for the fact that there are many more male mathematicians, airplane pilots, bush guides, mechanical engineers, architects, airplane pilots, and race car drivers than female ones. Study all you want, girls. You will never solve a Riccati equation. Why? The wigwam idea returns without bringing in Native Americans. It is no longer possible to demonize or idealize the wigwam. We must retreat to peoples who can no longer be insulted. This is Sabatini. Cavemen hunted, cave women gathered food near the home and took care of the children. But not to worry, our esteemed professor assures us, citing an even higher paternal authority, that great father of sociobiology at Harvard, Edward O. Wilson. You might not have evolved to make it as a bush guide, but, quote, human females tend to be higher than males in empathy, verbal skills, social skills, and security seeking, among other things, while men tend to be higher in independence, dominance, spatial and mathematical skills, rank-related aggression, and other characteristics, end quote. Our superior verbal skills, if we follow the professor's own logic, explain why women have dominated the literary arts for so long. Nary a man in sight. I am sure you have also noticed that when the titans of contemporary literature are referred to, both in academia and in the popular press, the numbers of women among them are quite simply overwhelming. I am happy to say that my own, or used-to-be own, Boris would not agree with Dr. Sabatini, up to his ears in rats as my old man is, and attached to evolution and genes as he also is. He knows that genes are expressed through the environment, that the brain is plastic and dynamic. It develops and changes over time in relation to what's out there. He also knows, despite our commonalities, that people are not rats, and that the higher executive functions in human beings can be decisive in determining what we become. And he knows that good science one day can become bad science the next, as was true of the sensational discovery in 1982 that the corpus callosum, the self-same fibrous brain hemisphere connector of Dr. Bean, especially one part of it known as the splenium, is actually larger in women than in men. This study, soon to be trumpeted to the masses by Newsweek magazine, claimed not that women were intellectually superior, an idea never advanced in the annals of human history, but rather that we of the large CCs have greater communication between the hemispheres of our brains, which in Newsweek was conveniently translated as women's intuition. But then a study of Korean men and women found that the pesky thing was bigger in men. Koreans must be special. Then another study found no difference. Other studies followed a little bigger, a little smaller, about the same, no difference. In 1997, Bishop and Walston, the authors of a review of 49 studies of the corpus callosum, concluded the widespread belief that women have a larger splenium than men and consequently think differently is untenable. Whoops! But the myth is still circulating. One simpleton eagerly spewing his own brain of pseudoscience has dubbed the CC the caring member of the brain. It is not that there is no difference between men and women. It is how much difference that difference makes and how we choose to frame it. Every era has had its science of difference and sameness, its biology, its ideology, and its ideological biology, which brings us at last back to the naughty girls, their escapades, and the instruments of darkness. But it won't bring us back to the naughty girls. It will bring us to an email sent by the daughter to her mother. Dear Mom, Dad has moved into a hotel. I'm not sure what's going on exactly, but we're going to have dinner on Thursday, and he has promised to talk to me. To be totally honest, I told him that he should really write to you, and he said he would. But I have to tell you, he sounds awfully sad on the telephone, all slowed down. He's no open book, Mom, but I will keep you posted. A week and a half I'll be in Boston, my little mammy dear, and will pop through your door and fling my arms around you. Love from your own Daisy girl. A. Boris dumped the pause. B. The pause dumped Boris. C. The affair was still on, but the duo had decided the pausal quarters were too small, hence hotel. D. The two parted by mutual agreement. E, none of the above. A was preferable to B, B to C, D was preferable to B, E was an unknown quantity, or X. Much inward churning and burning over A, B, C, D, and X. Considerable spinning of satisfying fantasies of prodigal spouse, prostrate, whoa, prostrate or kneeling in state of keen remorse. Other less satisfying fantasies of spousal heart broken by French woman. Some introspective activity on the conflicted state of own worn and tattered heart. No crying. Things are happening, but you don't quite know what, but this is how this section begins. Boris wooed. Mia, I was just a fat-headed guy full of pain. Boris. Reference. T.R. Devlin, played by Cary Grant, to Alicia Huberman, played by Ingrid Bergman, near the end of Notorious. The hero is, if I remember correctly, carrying his drugged by poison beloved down the stairs when he makes this remark. Boris and I had seen the film at least 7 times together, and every time B.I. had become tearful over this succinct explanation for Mr. Devlin's genuinely wretched treatment of the divine Miss Huberman. I was not unmoved by this bit of wooing. No, I won't hedge. I was moved. It would never do to replace Carrie with Boris or me with Ingrid. When I imagine my slightly rotund in the middle, bespectacled neuroscientist puffing and groaning as he bears frizzy-headed 55-year-old versifier down enormous Hollywood staircase, the illusion is lost. But that is not the point. We must all allow ourselves the fantasy of projection from time to time, a chance to clothe ourselves in the imaginary gowns and tails of what has never been and never will be. This gives some polish to our tarnished lives, and sometimes we may choose one dream over another, and in the choosing find some respite from ordinary sadness. After all, we, none of us, can ever untangle the knot of fictions that make up that wobbly thing we call a self. This is from a character in the book who's writing back and forth to Mia during the course of the book. She doesn't know who he is. His name is Mr. Nobody. And it's after one of the old ladies, a friend of Mia's and her mother, has died. I wrote to Nobody about her works, artworks, and the long-ago love affair. I don't know why I told him. Maybe I wanted an answer of some grandeur. I got it. Some of us are fated to live in a box from which there is only temporary release. We of the dammed-up spirits, of the thwarted feelings, of the blocked hearts, and the pent-up thoughts. We who long to blast out, flood forth in a torrent of rage or joy or even madness, but there is nowhere for us to go. Nowhere in the world, because no one will have us as we are, and there is nothing to do except to embrace the secret pleasures of our sublimations. The arc of a sentence, the kiss of a rhyme, the image that forms on paper or canvas, the inner cantata, the cloistered embroidery, the dark and dreaming needlepoint from hell or heaven or purgatory, or none of those three. But there must be some sound and fury from us, some clashing cymbals in the void. Who would deny us the mere pantomime of frenzy? We, the actors who pace back and forth on a stage no one watches, our guts heaving and our fists flying. Your friend was one of us, the never anointed, the unchosen, misshapen by life, by sex, cursed by fate, but still industrious under the covers where only the happy few venture, sewing apace for years, sewing her heartbreak and her spite and her spleen, and why not? Why? Why not? Why? Why not? This is near the very end of the book. Boris Iskovich had been wooing me in a steady, earnest manner, and had even sent me an egregious but touching poem that began, "I knew a girl named Mia who knew her rhyme and meter and onomatopoeia." It fell off badly after that, but what can one expect from a world-renowned neuroscientist? The sentiment expressed after those introductory lines was, as described by Daisy, total mush. That said, only the most hard-hearted among us have no use for mush or blarney, or those old ballads about lost and dead lovers, and only bona fide dunces are unable to take pleasure in the stories of ghostly figures who wander across moors or fields or out in the open air. And who among us would deny Jane Austen her happy endings, or insist that Cary Grant and Irene Dunne should not get back together at the end of The Awful Truth? There are tragedies and there are comedies, aren't there? And they are often more the same than different, rather like men and women, if you ask me. A comedy depends on stopping the story at exactly the right moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Siri. Once it was said that Paul Auster was a writer of mystery novels. Spin a web, tangle it, nurture some doubt, but see it all through to something like a satisfying resolution. But then the mystery on offer in Paul Auster's fiction was always of another order. Not necessarily mystery as metaphysics, by no means, but mystery in which the stakes seem larger than the immediate conundrum itself, and the satisfying resolution has to do with the opening out of further questions, frequently unanswerable questions that you wouldn't have thought about when the mystery first gathered force. A mystery writer, then, only if the epithet is taken to point in the direction of a fiction far removed from the ordinary conventions of that popular genre. Of course, Paul Auster has by now written a great many books. Early, a poet, and a very good one. He turned to fiction about 30 years ago and has since given us works astonishing in their variety. In an interview, he said, once upon a time, that in a sense, all of his books were the same. But then, only a few seconds later, he thought better of it and said, no, not the same, though written out of a broad set of common preoccupations. If all these books were put together in one volume, he went on, they would form the book of my life so far, unquote. Which does seem fair enough, even if it doesn't quite allow us to see the central something that informs all of his work. The difficulty, I suppose, lies again in this writer's prodigious range. To be sure, you do often have the sense when you enter one of his novels that you are in, well, you might call it Auster country. Not so much a matter of any particular density or eccentricity of language, but of a predilection for certain kinds of possibility, for possibility itself, a predilection for the imaginable, for the leap, extravagant or modest, for the swerve of perspective, for what he himself has called the music of chance. You think Auster when you read him quoting a letter from Flaubert with these words, "The antithesis of everything is always before my eyes," unquote. Words which tell you more, I think, about the fiction of Paul Auster than about the fiction of Flaubert. Paul Auster is, no doubt about it, not merely open to the music of chance, but more than half in love with it. And so, yes, predilections, but then also an incorrigible variety. One book written from the perspective of a woman, another that reads somewhat like a fairy tale, another detailed in the way of a more or less realist novel, the next more given over to the fantastic than you would ever have expected. Books that seem somehow personal, even anecdotal, others more capacious, drawing upon large historical events so that the experience of a character implies much more than any single character can possibly have witnessed. You read Paul Auster, and you understand why he says that for him, each book is a new book. That's it, exactly. This is a writer who writes out of his obsessions, and yet invariably makes it new and unexpected. And then maybe the pleasure we feel in the work of Paul Auster has mainly to do with yet something else. Haruki Murakami says the following, that when you read Auster, you give yourself up to a pure, almost physical musicality, waiting expectantly for something that will arrive, which never fails to arrive, like a passage of music for which we have been made ready, which falls upon us with what seems a perfect inevitability. Wonderful, this sense, I think, of an anticipated something for which we have not the adequate descriptive language, but which seems to us all the same palpable. What to call it? Another reader says, Auster has a way of making the real and the imagined seem to be one and the same. And that may well be as close to the thing we want to say about this writer as we can come. Anyway, I'll leave it at that and say, please welcome to this Writers Institute, Paul Auster.
Thank you, Bob, very much. Siri, it was amazing. And I have to say to everyone, the first time Siri gave a reading, it was probably about almost 30 years ago. She read with Harold Brodke, the late Harold Brodke, and she read a story brilliantly. And afterwards she said, "So how did I do?" She had never read in public before. I said, "It was great. It was just absolutely great, but you were 2 octaves too high." And since that day, almost 30 years ago, she's learned to lower her voice. And I think listening to her tonight was one of the great pleasures of this week. No one reads as well as you do, kid, I'll tell you. It was just great. The other night, Victoria, who was reading, said, this is the place where you come to expose new work. This is where you test it out. And I've just finished a little book, a nonfiction book, and I've just handed it into my publisher 2 weeks ago, so it's very fresh, and I thought I'm going to try it out on you. The fact is, it's an autobiographical book composed of fragments, and because there's so much in it, it's impossible to convey much in a short reading. But I suppose it is more or less a kind of physical history of myself, the story of my body. I know Philip wrote a book about his body. Well, this is not quite that, but it's probably in the same ballpark. The title is Winter Journal, and it was written quite literally beginning January 3rd till around April 1st this year. So this is how it begins. You think it will never happen to you, that it cannot happen to you, that you are the only person in the world to whom none of these things will ever happen. And then, one by one, they all begin to happen to you in the same way they happen to everyone else. Your bare feet on the cold floor as you climb out of bed and walk to the window. You are 6 years old. Outside, snow is falling, and the branches of the trees in the backyard are turning white. Speak now before it is too late, and then hope to go on speaking until there is nothing more to be said. Time is running out, after all. Perhaps it is just as well to put aside your stories for now and try to examine what it has felt like to live inside this body from the first day you can remember being alive until this one. A catalog of sensory data, what one might call a phenomenology of breathing. You are 10 years old, and the midsummer air is warm, oppressively warm, so humid and uncomfortable that even as you sit in the shade of the trees in the backyard, sweat is gathering on your forehead. It is an incontestable fact that you are no longer young. 1 month from today, you will be turning 64. And although that is not excessively old, not what anyone would consider to be an advanced old age, you cannot stop yourself from thinking about all the others who never managed to get as far as you have. This is one example of the various things that could never happen, but which, in fact, have happened. The wind in your face during last week's blizzard, the awful sting of the cold, and you out there in the empty streets wondering what possessed you to go outside in such a pounding storm, and yet, even as you struggled to keep your balance, there was the exhilaration of that wind, the joy of seeing the familiar streets turn into a blur of white, whirling snow. Physical pleasures and physical pains. Sexual pleasures, first and foremost, but also the pleasures of food and drink, of lying naked in a warm bath, of scratching an itch, of sneezing and farting, of spending an extra hour in bed, of turning your face toward the sun on a mild afternoon in late spring or early summer, feeling the warmth settle upon your skin. Innumerable instances, not a day gone by without some moment or moments of physical pleasure. And yet pains are no doubt more persistent and intractable. And at one time or another, nearly every part of your body has been subjected to assault. Eyes and ears, head and neck, shoulders and back, arms and legs, throat and stomach, ankles and feet, not to mention the enormous boil that once sprouted on the left cheek of your ass, referred to by the doctor as a wen, which to your ears sounded like some medieval affliction and prevented you from sitting in chairs for a week. The proximity of your small body to the ground, the body that belonged to you when you were 3 and 4 years old, that is to say, the shortness of the distance between your feet and your head, and how the things you no longer notice were once a constant presence and preoccupation for you. The little world of crawling ants and lost coins, of fallen twigs and dented bottle caps, of dandelions and clover. But especially the ants. They are what you remember best. Armies of ants traveling in and out of their powdery hills. You were 5 years old, crouched over an anthill in the backyard, attentively studying the comings and goings of your tiny 6-legged friends. Unseen and unheard, your 3-year-old neighbor creeps up behind you and strikes you on the head with a toy rake. The prongs pierce your scalp, blood flows into your hair and down the back of your neck, and you run screaming into the house where your grandmother tends to your wounds. Your grandmother's words to your mother: "Your father would be such a wonderful man if only he were different." This morning, waking in the dimness of another January dawn, a scumbled grayish light seeping into the bedroom, and there is your wife's face turned toward your face, her eyes closed, still fast asleep, the covers pulled all the way up to her neck, her head the only part of her that is visible. And you marvel at how beautiful she looks, how young she looks, even now, 30 years after you first slept with her, after 30 years of living together under the same roof and sharing the same bed. More snow falling today. As you climb out of bed and walk to the window, the branches of the trees in the back garden are turning white. You are 63 years old. It occurs to you that there has rarely been a moment during the long journey from boyhood to now when you have not been in love. 30 years of marriage, yes, but in the 30 years before that, how many infatuations and crushes, how many ardors and pursuits, how many deliriums and mad surges of desire. From the very start of your conscious life, you have been a willing slave of Eros. The girls you loved as a boy, the women you loved as a man, each one different from the others, some round and some lean, some short and some tall, some bookish and some athletic, some moody and some outgoing, some white and some black and some Asian. Nothing on the surface ever mattered to you. It was all about the inner light you would detect in her, the spark of singularity, the blaze of revealed selfhood, and that light would make her beautiful to you, even if others were blind to the beauty you saw. And then you would burn to be with her, to be near her, for feminine beauty is something you have never been able to resist. All the way back to your first days of school, the kindergarten class in which you fell for the girl with the long blonde ponytail, and how often were you punished by Miss Sandquist for sneaking off with the little girl you had fallen for, the two of you together in a corner somewhere, making mischief. But those punishments meant nothing to you, for you were in love, and you were a fool for love then, just as you are a fool for love now. Jumping ahead. What presses in on you? What is always pressed in on you? The outside, meaning the air, or more precisely, your body in the air around you. The soles of your feet anchored to the ground, but all the rest of you exposed to the air. And that is where the story begins, in your body, and everything will end in the body as well. For now, you are thinking about the wind. Later, if time allows for it, you will think about the heat and the cold, the infinite varieties of rain, the fogs you have stumbled through like a man without eyes, the demented machine gun tattoo of hailstones clattering against the tile roof of the house in the Var. But it is the wind that claims your attention now, for the air is seldom still, and beyond the barely perceptible breath of nothingness that sometimes surrounds you, there are the breezes and wafting lilts, the sudden gusts and squalls, the 3-day-long mistrals you lived through in that house with the tile roof, the soaking nor'easters that sweep along the Atlantic coast, the gales and hurricanes, the whirlwinds. And there you are, 21 years ago, walking through the streets of Amsterdam on your way to an event that has been canceled without your knowledge, dutifully trying to fulfill the commitment you have made, out in what will later be called the storm of the century, a hurricane of such blistering intensity that within an hour of your stubborn, ill-advised decision to venture outdoors, large trees will be uprooted in every corner of the city, chimneys will tumble to the ground, and parked cars will be lifted up and go sailing through the air. You walk with your face to the wind, trying to advance along the sidewalk, but in spite of your efforts to get to where you are going, you cannot move. The wind is blasting into you, and for the next minute and a half, you are stuck. Your hands on the Halfpenny Bridge in Dublin 13 Januaries ago, the night following another hurricane with 100-mile-an-hour winds, the final night of the film you have been directing for the past 2 months, the last scene, the last shot, a simple matter of fixing the camera on the gloved hand of your leading actress as she turns her wrists and lets go of a small stone that will fall into the waters of the Liffey. There's nothing to it. No shot has demanded less effort or ingenuity in the entire film. But there you are in the dank and dark of that windswept night, as exhausted as you have ever been, after 9 weeks of grueling work on a production fraught with countless problems. Budget problems, union problems, location problems, weather problems. 15 pounds lighter than when you began. And after standing for hours on the bridge with your crew, the clammy, frigid Irish air has infiltrated your bones, and a moment comes just before the final shot when you realize that your hands are frozen, that you cannot move your fingers, that your hands have turned into 2 blocks of ice. Why aren't you wearing gloves, you ask yourself. But you are unable to answer the question, since the thought of gloves never even occurred to you when you left your hotel for the bridge. You film the last shot one more time, and then you and your producer, along with your actress's boyfriend, and several members of the crew, go to a nearby pub to thaw out and celebrate the completion of the film. The place is crowded, jammed full, an echo chamber packed with roaring, clamorous people, bobbing back and forth in a state of apocalyptic merriment. But a table has been reserved for you and your friends, so you sit down at the table. And the moment your body makes contact with the chair, you understand that you are depleted, drained of all physical energy, all emotional energy, utterly spent in a way you never would have imagined possible, so crushed that you feel you might burst into tears at any moment. You order a whiskey, and when you take hold of the glass and raise it to your lips, you are heartened to notice that your fingers can move again. You order a second whiskey, then a third whiskey, then a fourth whiskey, and suddenly you fall asleep. In spite of the frenzy all around you, you manage to go on sleeping until the good man who is your producer hoists you to your feet and half drags you, half carries you back to your hotel. Yes, you drink too much and smoke too much. You have lost teeth without bothering to replace them. Your diet does not conform to the precepts of contemporary nutritional wisdom. But if you shun most vegetables, it is simply because you do not like them, and you find it difficult, if not impossible, to eat what you do not like. You know that your wife worries about you, especially about your smoking and drinking, but mercifully, until now, no X-ray has revealed any damage to your lungs, no blood test has revealed any devastation to your liver, and so you forge on with your vile habits, knowing full well that they will ultimately do you grave harm. But the older you become, the less likely it seems that you will ever have the will or the courage to abandon your beloved little cigars and frequent glasses of wine, which have given you so much pleasure over the years. And you sometimes think that if you were to cut these things out of your life at this late date, your body would simply fall apart. Your system would cease to function. No doubt you are a flawed and wounded person, a man who has carried a wound in him from the very beginning. Why else would you have spent the whole of your adult life bleeding words onto a page? And the benefits you derive from alcohol and tobacco serve as crutches to keep your crippled self upright and moving through the world. Self-medication, as your wife calls it. To her great credit, unlike your mother's mother, your wife does not want you to be different. She tolerates your weaknesses and does not rant or scold, and if she worries, it is only because she wants you to go on. It is only because she wants you to live forever. You count the reasons why you have held her close to you for so many years, and surely this is one of them. One of the bright stars in the vast constellation of enduring love. A little break. 1952. 5 years old, naked in the tub, alone, big enough to wash yourself now. And as you lie on your back in the warm water, your penis suddenly springs to attention, popping out above the waterline. Until this moment, you have seen your penis only from above, standing on your feet and looking down, but from this new vantage point, more or less at eye level, it occurs to you that the tip of your circumcised male organ bears a striking resemblance to a helmet. an old-fashioned sort of helmet, similar to those worn by firemen in the late 19th century. This revelation pleases you, since at that juncture of your life, your greatest ambition is to grow up to become a fireman, which you consider to be the most heroic job on the face of the earth. No doubt it is. And how fitting that you should have a miniature fireman's helmet emblazoned on your very person, on the very part of your body, moreover, that looks like and functions as a hose. Okay. All right, we're jumping forward now about 20 more pages, but we're on the same subject. There's a lot about sex in this book, but I'm not reading those parts. Sorry. The years before sex entered the equation, before you understood that the miniature fireman between your legs was good for anything but helping you empty your bladder. It must be 1952 again, but perhaps a little earlier or a little later than that. And you asked your mother the question all children ask their parents, the standard question about where babies come from, meaning, where did you come from? And by what mysterious process did you enter the world as a human being? Your mother's answer is so abstract, so evasive, so metaphorical, that it leaves you utterly confounded. She says, the father plants the seed in the mother, and little by little the baby begins to grow. At this point in your life, the only seeds you are familiar with are the ones that produce flowers and vegetables, the ones that farmers scatter over large fields at planting time to start a new round of crops for harvest in the fall. You instantly see an image in your head. Your father dressed as a farmer. A cartoon version of a farmer in blue overalls with a straw hat on his head. And he is walking along with a large rake propped against his shoulder, walking with a jaunty, insouciant stride out in some rural nowhere on his way to plant the seed. For some time afterward, this was the picture you saw whenever the subject of babies was mentioned. Your old man is a farmer, dressed in blue overalls with a ragged straw hat on his head and a rake propped against his shoulder. You knew there was something wrong about this, however, for seeds were always planted in the earth, either in gardens or large fields, and since your mother was neither a garden nor a field, you had no idea what to make of this horticultural presentation of the facts of life. Is it possible for anyone to be more stupid than you were? You were a stupid little boy who lacked the wit to ask the question again. But the truth was that you enjoyed imagining your father as a farmer, enjoyed seeing him in that ridiculous costume. And when it comes right down to it, you probably wouldn't have understood what your mother was talking about if she had given you a more precise answer to your question. Okay, now we're jumping probably 70 pages forward. You would like to know who you are. With little or nothing to guide you, you take it for granted that you are the product of vast prehistoric migrations, of conquests, rapes, and abductions, that the long and circuitous intersections of your ancestral horde have extended over many territories and kingdoms. For you are not the only person who has traveled, after all. Tribes of human beings have been moving around the earth for tens of thousands of years, and who knows who begat whom, begat whom, begat whom, begat whom, begat whom, to end up with your two parents begetting you in 1947. You can go back only as far as your grandparents, with some scant information about your great-grandparents on your mother's side, which means that the generations that came before them are no more than blank space, a void of conjecture and blind guesswork. All four of the grandparents were Eastern European Jews. The two on your father's side, born in the late 1870s, in the city of Stanislav, in the backwater province of Galicia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, subsequently part of Poland after World War I, later part of the Soviet Union after World War II, and now part of Ukraine following the end of the Cold War, whereas the two on your mother's side were born in 1893 and 1895, your grandmother in Minsk and your grandfather in Toronto, a year after his family emigrated from Warsaw. Both of your grandmothers were redheads, and on both sides of your family there's a tumultuous mix of physical features in the many offspring who followed them, ranging from the dark-haired to the blonde, from the brown-skinned to the pale and freckled, from curls and waves to no curls and no waves, from stout peasant bodies with thick legs and stubby fingers to the lithe and elongated contours of still other bodies. The Eastern European genetic pool. But who knows where those nameless ghosts had been wandering before they came to the cities of Russia, Poland, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For how else to account for the fact that your sister was born with a Mongolian blue spot on her back, something that occurs only in Asian babies? And how else to account for the fact that you, with your brownish skin and wavy hair and gray-green eyes, have eluded ethnic identification for your entire life, and have been variously told by strangers that you must be, and most certainly are, an Italian, a Greek, a Spaniard, a Lebanese, an Egyptian, and even a Pakistani. Because you know nothing about where you come from, you long ago decided to presume that you are a composite of all the races of the Eastern Hemisphere, part African, part Arab, part Chinese, part Indian, part Caucasian, the melting pot of numerous warring civilizations in a single body. As much as anything else, it is a moral position, a way of eliminating the question of race, which is a bogus question in your opinion, a question that can only bring dishonor to the person who asks it. And therefore, you have consciously decided to be everyone, to embrace everyone inside you in order to be most fully and freely yourself, since who you are is a mystery and you have no hope that it will ever be solved. Jumping forward again. Looking at your right hand as it grips the black fountain pen you are using to write this journal, you think of Keats looking at his own right hand under similar circumstances, in the act of writing one of his last poems, and suddenly breaking off to scribble 8 lines in the margins of the manuscript, the bitter outcry of a young man who knew he was headed for an early grave, darkly underscored by the word now in the first line, for every now necessarily implies a later, and what later could Keats look forward to but the prospect of his own death? This living hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping, would, if it were cold, and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights, that thou would wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again, and thou be conscience calmed. See, here it is. I hold it toward you. Keats to begin with, but no sooner do you think of this living hand than you are reminded of a story someone once told you about James Joyce. Joyce in Paris in the 1920s, standing around at a party 85 years ago, when a woman walked up to him and asked if she could shake the hand that wrote Ulysses. Instead of offering her his right hand, Joyce lifted it in the air, studied it for a few moments, and said, "Let me remind you, madam, that this hand has done many other things as well." No details given, but what a delicious piece of smut and innuendo. All the more effective because he left everything to the woman's imagination. What did he want her to see? Wiping his ass, probably, picking his nose, masturbating in bed at night, sticking his fingers into Nora's cunt and diddling her bunghole, popping pimples, scraping food from his teeth, plucking out nostril hairs, disgorging wax from his ears. Fill in the appropriate blanks, the central point being whatever was most disgusting to her. Your hands have served you in similar ways, of course. Everyone's hands have done these things, but mostly they are busy performing tasks that require little or no thought, opening and closing doors, screwing light bulbs into sockets, dialing telephones, washing dishes, turning the pages of books, holding your pen, brushing your teeth, drying your hair, folding towels, taking money out of your wallet, carrying bags of groceries, swiping your Metro card in subway turnstiles, pushing buttons on machines, picking up the newspaper from the front steps in the morning, turning down the covers of the bed, showing your ticket to the train conductor, flushing the toilet, lighting your little cigars, stubbing out your little cigars in ashtrays, putting on your pants, taking off your pants, tying your shoes, squirting shaving cream onto the tips of your fingers, clapping at plays and concerts, sliding keys into locks, scratching your face, scratching your arms, scratching your ass, wheeling suitcases through airports, unpacking suitcases, putting your shirts on hangers, zipping up your fly, buckling your belt, buttoning your jacket, knotting your tie, drumming your fingers on tables, loading paper into your fax machine, tearing checks out of your checkbook, opening up boxes of tea, switching on lights, switching off lights, plumping up your pillow before going to bed. Those same hands have sometimes punched people, as previously noted. And 3 or 4 times in moments of intense frustration, they have also punched walls. They have thrown plates onto the floor, dropped plates onto the floor, and picked up plates from the floor. Your right hand has shaken more hands than you could possibly count, has blown your nose, wiped your ass, and waved goodbye more often than the number of words in the largest dictionary. Your hands have held the bodies of your children, have wiped the asses and blown the noses of your children, have bathed your children, rubbed the backs of your children, dried the tears of your children, and stroked the faces of your children. They have patted the shoulders of friends, work comrades, and relatives. They have pushed and shoved, pulled people off the ground, gripped the arms of people who were about to fall, navigated the wheelchairs of those who could not walk. They have touched the bodies of clothed and naked women. They have moved down the length of your wife's naked skin and found their way onto every part of her. They are happiest there, you feel, have always been happiest there since the day you met her. For, to paraphrase a line from one of George Oppen's poems, some of the most beautiful places in the world are on your wife's body. Jumping forward again. Things were the way they were, and you never stopped to question them. There were public schools and Catholic schools in your town, and because you were not Catholic, you attended the public schools, which were considered to be good schools, at least by the standards that were used to measure such things at the time. And according to what your mother later told you, it was for this reason that your family moved to the house on Irving Avenue in the months before you were scheduled to begin kindergarten. You have nothing to compare your experience with, but in the 13 years you spent in that system, the first 7 at Marshall School, K through 6, the next 3 at South Orange Junior High School, 7 through 9, and the last 3 at Columbia High School in Maplewood, 10 through 12, you had some good teachers and some mediocre teachers, a handful of exceptional and inspiring teachers, and a handful of lousy and incompetent teachers. And your fellow students ranged from the brilliant to the average to the semi-moronic. Such is the case with all public schools. Everyone who lives in the district can go for free, and because you grew up in a time before the advent of special education, before separate schools had been established to accommodate children with so-called problems, a number of your classmates were physically handicapped. No one in a wheelchair that you can remember, but you can still see the hunchback boy with the twisted body, the girl who is missing an arm, a fingerless stump jutting from her shoulders, the drooling boy who slobbered down the front of his shirt, and the girl who was scarcely taller than a midget. Looking back on it now, you feel that these people were an essential part of your education, that without their presence in your life, your understanding of what it means to be human would have been impoverished, lacking all depth and compassion, all insight into the metaphysics of pain and adversity. For those children were the heroic ones, the ones who had to work 10 times harder than any of the others to find a place for themselves. If you had lived only among the physically blessed, the children like yourself, who took your well-formed bodies for granted, how would you have ever learned what heroism was? One of your friends from those years was a plump, non-athletic boy with glasses and a homely, chinless sort of face. But he was much loved by the other boys for his sharp wit and humor, his prowess at math, and what struck you then as an uncommon generosity of spirit. He had a bedridden younger brother, a boy suffering from a disease that had stunted his growth and left him with brittle bones, bones that broke from the slightest contact with hard surfaces, bones that broke for no reason at all. And you can remember visiting your friend's house after school on several occasions and going in to see his brother, who was just a year or two younger than you were, lying in a hospital bed rigged with pulleys and wires, his legs in plaster casts, with his large head and impossibly pale skin. And you could hardly open your mouth in that room. You felt nervous, perhaps a bit scared, but the brother was a nice kid, friendly and affable and bright. It had always struck you as absurd, altogether outrageous, that he should be lying in that bed. And every time you saw him, you wondered what idiot God had decreed that he should be locked inside that body and not you. Your friend was devoted to him. They were as close to each other as any brothers you have ever known. And they shared a private, two-person world, a secret universe dominated by a mutual obsession with the fantasy baseball game they played, a board game with dice, cards, complex rules, and elaborate statistics, meticulously keeping records of every game they played, which evolved into entire seasons of games. Every month or two, another season, season after season of imaginary games as the years rolled on. How perfectly right you realize now that it should have been this friend of yours who called you one evening in the winter of 1957-58, not long after the Dodgers had announced their move from Brooklyn to Los Angeles, to tell you that Roy Campanella, the all-star catcher, had been in a car accident, an accident so terrible that even if he pulled through, he would be paralyzed for the rest of his life. Your friend was weeping into the phone. And then a few other sections from towards the end. The dancers saved you. They are the ones who brought you back to life that evening in December 1978, who made it possible for you to experience the scalding, epiphanic moment of clarity that pushed you through a crack in the universe and allowed you to begin again. Bodies in motion, bodies in space, bodies leaping and twisting through empty, unimpeded air. 8 dancers in a high school gym in Manhattan. 4 men and 4 women, all of them young. 8 dancers in their early 20s, and you sitting in the bleachers with a dozen or so acquaintances of the choreographer to watch an open rehearsal of her new piece. You had been invited by David Reed, a painter you met on the student ship that took you to Europe in 1965, which is discussed earlier. Now your oldest friend in New York would ask you to come because he was romantically involved with the choreographer, Nina W., a woman you did not know well and whose affair with David did not last long. But if you are not distorting the facts, you believe she had started out as a dancer at Merce Cunningham's troupe, and now that she had turned her energies to choreography, her work bore some resemblance to Cunningham's, muscular, spontaneous, unpredictable. It was the darkest moment of your life. You were 31 years old. Your first marriage had just cracked apart. You had an 18-month-old son and no regular job, no money to speak of, grinding out your meager, inadequate living as a freelance translator, author of 3 small books of poetry with at most 100 readers in the world, padding your pittance of an income by writing critical pieces for Harper's, the New York Review of Books, and other magazines. And apart from a pseudonymous detective novel you had written the previous summer in an effort to generate some cash, which still had no publisher, your work had come to a halt. You were stuck and confused. You had not written a poem in more than a year, and you were slowly coming to the realization that you would never be able to write again. Such was the spot you were in that winter evening 33 years ago when you walked into the high school gym to watch the open rehearsal of Nina W.'s work in progress. You knew nothing about dance, still know nothing about dance, but you have always responded to it with a soaring inner happiness whenever you see it done well. As you took your seat next to David, You had no idea what to expect, since at that point Nina W.'s work was unknown to you. She stood on the gym floor and explained to the tiny audience that the rehearsal would be divided into 2 alternating parts: demonstrations of the principal movements of the piece by the dancers and verbal commentary from her. Then she stepped aside and the dancers began to move around the floor. The first thing that struck you was that there was no musical accompaniment. The possibility had never occurred to you, dancing in silence rather than to music, for music had always seemed essential to dance, inseparable from dance, not only because it sets the rhythm and speed of the performance, but because it establishes an emotional tone for the spectator, giving a narrative coherence to what would otherwise be entirely abstract. But in this case, the dancers' bodies were responsible for establishing the rhythm and tone of the piece. And once you began to settle into it, you found the absence of music wholly invigorating, since the dancers were hearing the music in their heads, the rhythms in their heads, hearing what could not be heard. And because these 8 young people were good dancers, in fact, excellent dancers, it wasn't long before you began to hear those rhythms in your head as well. No sounds then, except the sounds of bare feet thumping against the wooden floor of the gym. You can't remember the details of their movements, but in your mind you see jumping and spinning, falling and sliding, arms waving and arms dropping to the floor, legs kicking out and running forward, bodies touching and then not touching, and you are impressed by the grace and athleticism of the dancers. The mere sight of their bodies in motion seems to be carrying you to some unexplored place within yourself. And little by little you felt something lift inside you, felt joy rising through your body and up into your head, a physical joy that was also of the mind, a mounting joy that spread and continued to spread through every part of you. Then, after 6 or 7 minutes, the dancers stopped. Nina W. stepped forward to explain to the audience what they had just witnessed. And the more she talked, the more earnestly and passionately she tried to articulate the movements and patterns of the dance, the less you understood what she was saying. It wasn't because she was using technical terms that were unfamiliar to you. It was the more fundamental fact that her words were utterly useless, inadequate to the task of describing the wordless performance you had just seen, for no words could convey the fullness and brute physicality of what the dancers had done. Then she stepped aside and the dancers began to move again, immediately filling you with the same joy you had felt before they stopped. 5 or 6 minutes later, they stopped again, and once more Nina W. came forward to speak, again failing to capture 100th part of the beauty you had just seen. And back and forth it went for the next hour, the dancers taking turns with the choreographer, bodies in motion followed by words, beauty followed by meaningless noise, joy followed by boredom. And at a certain point, something began to open up inside you. You found yourself falling through the rift between world and word, the chasm that divides human life from our capacity to understand or express the truth of human life. And for reasons that still confound you, this sudden fall through the empty, unbounded air filled you with a sensation of freedom and happiness. By the time the performance was over, you were no longer blocked, no longer burdened by the doubts that had been weighing you down for the past year. You returned to your house in Dutchess County, to the downstairs workroom where you had been sleeping since the end of your marriage. And the next day you began to write. For 3 weeks you worked on a text of no definable genre, neither a poem nor a prose narrative, attempting to describe what you had seen and felt as you watched the dancers dance and the choreographer talk in that high school gym in Manhattan, writing many pages to begin with and then boiling them down to 8 pages, the first work of your second incarnation as a writer, the bridge to everything you have written in the years since then. And you remember finishing during a snowstorm late one Saturday night, 2 o'clock in the morning, the only person awake in the house. And the terrible thing about that night, the thing that continues to haunt you, is that just as you were finishing your piece, which you eventually called White Spaces, your father was dying in the arms of his girlfriend. The ghoulish trigonometry of fate. Just as you were coming back to life, your father's life was coming to an end. In order to do what you do, you need to walk. Walking is what brings the words to you, what allows you to hear the rhythms of the words as you write them in your head. 1 foot forward, and then the other foot forward, the double drumbeat of your heart. 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 feet, this, and then that, and then this. Writing begins in the body. It is the music of the body. And even if the words have meaning, can sometimes have meaning, the music of the words is where the meanings begin. You sit at your desk in order to write down the words, but in your head, you are still walking, always walking. And what you hear is the rhythm of your heart, the beating of your heart. Mandelstam. I wonder how many pairs of sandals Dante wore out while working on the Commedia, writing as a lesser form of dance. Then one last bit, jumping ahead. You heard the dead calling out to you, but only once in all the years you have been alive. You are not someone who sees things that are not there, and while you have often been confused by what you are seeing, you are not prone to hallucinations or fantastical alterations of reality. The same with your ears. Every now and then, while out on one of your walks through the city, you think you hear someone calling to you. Think you hear the voice of your wife or daughter or son shouting your name from across the street. But when you turn around to look for them, it is always someone else saying, Paul, or Dad, or Daddy. 20 years ago, however, perhaps 25 years ago, under circumstances far removed from the flow of your daily life, you experienced an auditory hallucination that continues to bewilder you with its vividness and power, the sheer volume of the voices you heard, even though the chorus of the dead screamed out in you for no more than 5 or 10 seconds. You were in Germany, spending the weekend in Hamburg, and on Sunday morning your friend Michael Naumann, who was also your German publisher, suggested that the two of you pay a visit to Bergen-Belsen, or rather to the site where Bergen-Belsen had once stood. You wanted to go, even if a part of you was reluctant to go, and you remember the drive there on the nearly empty Autobahn that overcast Sunday morning, a white-gray sky hanging over mile after mile of flat land, seeing a car that had crashed into a tree by the side of the road and the corpse of the driver lying on the grass, a body so inert and twisted that you immediately knew the man was dead. And there you were, sitting in the car and thinking about Anne Frank and her sister Margot, who had both died in Bergen-Belsen, along with tens of thousands of others, the many thousands of others who perished there from typhus and starvation, random beatings, murder. The dozens of films and newsreels you had seen of the death camps were spooling through your head as you sat in the passenger seat of the car. And as you and Michael approached your destination, you found yourself growing more and more anxious and withdrawn. Nothing was left of the camp itself. The buildings had been torn down, the barracks had been demolished and carted away, the barbed wire fences had vanished, and what stood there now was a small museum, a one-story structure filled with poster-sized black and white photographs along with explanatory texts. A grim place, an awful place, but so denuded and antiseptic that you found it hard to imagine the reality of the place as it had been during the war. You couldn't feel the presence of the dead, the horror of so many thousands crammed into that nightmare village surrounded by barbed wire. And as you walked through the museum with Michael, in your memory you were the only people there. You wished the camp had been left intact so the world could have seen what the architecture of barbarism had looked like. Then you went outside, onto the grounds where the death camp had stood. But it was a grassy field now, a domain of lovely, well-tended grass, stretching for several hundred yards in all directions. And if not for the various markers planted in the ground that indicated where the barracks had once been, where certain buildings had once been, there would have been no way to guess what had gone on there several decades earlier. Then you came to a patch of grass that was slightly elevated, 3 or 4 inches higher than the rest of the field, a perfect rectangle that measured about 20 feet by 30 feet, the size of a large room. And in one corner there was a marker in the ground that read, "Here lie the bodies of 50,000 Russian soldiers." You were standing on top of the grave of 50,000 men. It didn't seem possible that so many dead bodies could fit into such a small space. And when you tried to imagine those bodies beneath you, the tangled corpses of 50,000 young men packed into what must have been the deepest of deep holes, you began to grow dizzy at the thought of so much death concentrated in such a small patch of ground. And a moment later you heard the screams. A tremendous surge of voices rose up from the ground beneath you, and you heard the bones of the dead howl in anguish, howl in pain, howl in a roaring cascade of full-throated, ear-splitting torment. The earth was screaming. For 5 or 10 seconds you heard them, and then they went silent. Thank you.